Welcome to this journey into the shadows of history, where love and madness become indistinguishable, and the boundaries between devotion and horror blur beyond recognition. I'm your host, and tonight we descend into the frozen hills of Vermont, into a story that challenges everything we think we know about grief, obsession, and the terrible things people do when they cannot let go. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. Are you listening to this alone in your room at night? Maybe you're driving through empty roads, or perhaps you're working late, looking for something to fill the silence. Tell me in the comments below where you are and what time it is where you're watching. This story feels different depending on where you hear it, and I'm curious to know how many of you are brave enough to journey through this darkness with me. The year is 1898. The place is a small, unnamed settlement in the mountains of northeastern Vermont, where winter arrives in October and doesn't release its grip until late April. This is a land of endless forests, where logging camps dot the landscape and communities exist in pockets of civilization, surrounded by wilderness that feels older than memory itself. In this isolated corner of New England, where the wind howls through pine trees like the voices of the dead and snow can bury a man's cabin overnight, there lived a young carpenter named Thomas Whitmore. He was 28 years old, known throughout the T region as a quiet, skilled craftsman who could build furniture so beautiful it seemed touched by something beyond mere human hands. Thomas had calloused palms, dark hair that always seemed slightly disheveled, and eyes that neighbors would later describe as too intense, even before everything happened. Thomas was engaged to marry Miss Eliza Frost, the 22-year-old daughter of Harold Frost, a prosperous lumber mill owner whose family had lived in Vermont for 3 generations. Eliza was, by all accounts, a delicate beauty with auburn hair, pale skin that seemed almost translucent in winter light, and a laugh that could warm even the coldest February morning. She played piano, read poetry, and had dreams of one day traveling to Boston to see the theater and experience life beyond the mountain isolation she'd known since birth. Their wedding was planned for June of 1898, when the mountain laurels would bloom and the world would shake off winter's death grip. Thomas had spent months building a small house for them, carved from timber he'd selected himself, with windows positioned to catch the morning sun and a fireplace built from river stones he'd gathered by hand. But February of 1898 brought something darker than snow. Tuberculosis, that silent killer of the 19th century, found its way into Eliza's lungs. The disease moved quickly, as it often did with young women. Within 3 weeks of her first cough, Eliza Frost was dead, her final breath rattling out of her chest on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, while Thomas held her hand and whispered promises that he would never, ever let her go. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in Vermont's criminal archives. What Thomas Whitmore did in the months following Eliza's death would challenge the very definition of love itself and force an entire community to confront the horrifying question, how far is too far when grief consumes everything you are? The sheriff who eventually entered Thomas Whitmore's cabin that spring would later tell his wife that he wished he'd never become a lawman, that some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and that the smell that hit him when he opened that door haunted his dreams until the day he died in 1923. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened, to truly grasp the depth of what Thomas did and why an entire township would spend decades trying to forget the name Eliza Frost, we need to go back. Back to the winter of 1898, back to a time when death was close, when the line between the living and the dead was thinner than we like to believe, and when one man's love became so twisted that it transformed into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. This is the story of the disturbing preservation of Miss Eliza Frost. And I warn you now, before we continue, that what follows is not a tale of redemption or hope. This is a descent into darkness from which no one emerged unchanged. To understand the horror that unfolded in that Vermont cabin, we must first understand the world that shaped Thomas Whitmore and Eliza Frost. The 1890s were a peculiar time in rural New England, caught between the old superstitions of colonial America and the emerging rationalism of the 20th century. Vermont in this era was a land of contradictions. While cities like Burlington were experiencing the beginnings of industrialization, the mountain communities remained fiercely isolated, sometimes cut off from the outside world for months during the brutal winters. In these remote settlements, old beliefs persisted, whispered traditions that had roots in both Puritan Christianity and something older, something that predated European settlement entirely. Death in 1898 Vermont was not the sanitized, distant thing it would become in later generations. People died at home. Bodies were prepared by family members. Wakes lasted for days, with the deceased laid out in the parlor while neighbors came to pay respects. Children grew up seeing death as part of the natural rhythm of life, yet this familiarity bred its own kind of terror. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was particularly feared because of how it seemed to consume its victims from within, leaving them pale, ethereal, almost beautiful in their final days. The Frost family had arrived in Vermont in the 1730s, among the first settlers to push into the mountain regions. Harold Frost, Eliza's father, had built his lumber empire through ruthless efficiency and an intimate knowledge of the forests. His mill employed nearly 40 men, and his influence extended throughout the county. He was a stern man, shaped by the harsh environment, a widower who had raised Eliza alone after her mother died, giving birth to a stillborn son when Eliza was only 7 years old. Eliza had grown up in a large house on the edge of town, a structure that seemed almost pretentious in its size compared to the modest cabins that surrounded it. She'd been educated by a private tutor from Boston, a luxury almost unheard of in the mountains. Neighbors described her as kind but somewhat removed, a girl who seemed to exist slightly apart from the rough reality of logging town life. Thomas Whitmore's background was darker, more mysterious. He'd arrived in Vermont in 1895, claiming to be from New Hampshire, though he never spoke of his family or his past. He'd established himself quickly as a master carpenter, taking on work that ranged from building coffins to crafting elaborate furniture for the wealthier families. There was something about his work that disturbed some of the older residents. The furniture he built was too perfect, too precisely measured, as if he understood the mathematics of wood in a way that wasn't entirely natural. How Thomas and Eliza met remains unclear. In the historical record, some accounts suggest Harold Frost hired Thomas to build a new bookcase for Eliza's birthday in 1896. Others claim they met at a church social. What is clear is that by the spring of 1897, they were engaged, and Harold Frost, despite his initial reservations about the quiet carpenter with no family history, had given his blessing. The community's response to their engagement was mixed. Some saw it as a practical match, a skilled tradesman, marrying into prosperity. Others whispered that there was something odd about Thomas's devotion to Eliza, something too intense in how he looked at her, as if he were memorizing every detail of her face, as if he were already preparing for loss. Winter in Vermont during this period was a time of enforced isolation. Snow could reach depths of 6, 7, even 8 feet in the mountains. Roads became impassable. Communities turned inward, and cabin fever became a genuine medical concern. The long darkness of December and January, when the sun barely climbed above the horizon, when temperatures could drop to 30 degrees below zero, when the wind howled like something alive and malevolent, this darkness had a way of getting inside people's minds. It was in this context, in the crushing isolation of a Vermont winter, that tuberculosis found Eliza Frost. The disease was rampant in the 1890s, killing more people than any other illness. It spread easily in the close quarters of winter, when families huddled together for warmth and fresh air, was scarce. Eliza's first symptoms appeared in late January, a persistent cough that she initially dismissed as nothing serious. By early February, she was bedridden. The local doctor, a man named Samuel Hendricks, who served the entire region from his small office in town, recognized tuberculosis immediately. He'd seen it claim dozens of lives. There was no cure, no treatment beyond rest and prayer. Dr. Hendricks gave Eliza weeks. At most, Thomas moved into the Frost house to care for Eliza in her final days. Harold Frost, devastated at the prospect of losing his only child, seemed to age a decade in those 2 weeks. Neighbors who visited described a house filled with the smell of sickness, the sound of Eliza's labored breathing, and Thomas's constant presence at her bedside. He barely slept. He barely ate. He sat beside her, holding her hand, reading her poetry, telling her about the house he'd built for them, describing the life they would never have. On February 14th, 1898, as a blizzard buried the town under 3 feet of fresh snow, Eliza Frost died. She was 22 years old. Her final words, according to Thomas, were, "Promise me you won't forget me. Promise me I won't disappear." Thomas promised, and he would keep that promise in a way that no one could have imagined. The funeral should have happened within 2 days, as was customary. But the blizzard made travel to the cemetery impossible. The ground was frozen solid, making burial impractical until spring thaw. This was not unusual. In Vermont winters, bodies were sometimes kept in above-ground crypts or storage buildings until the ground could be broken in April or May. But Thomas Whitmore had other plans, plans that were already forming in his mind, plans that would transform grief into something monstrous, plans that would ensure Eliza Frost would never truly leave him. What happened next would not be discovered for nearly 3 months, and when the truth finally emerged, it would shake the foundations of that small Vermont community and create a legend that would persist for more than a century. The first sign that something was wrong came in late February, about 10 days after Eliza's death. Harold Frost, consumed by grief, had retreated into his own sorrow, barely leaving his house. The community assumed Thomas had arranged for Eliza's body to be kept in the town's cold storage shed, a common practice during winter months when burial was impossible. But Martha Hendricks, the doctor's wife, and one of the town's most observant residents, noticed something peculiar. She recorded in her diary, which was discovered in 1953 during the demolition of the old Hendricks house, February 24th, 1898, saw Thomas Whitmore at Grayson's General Store today. He purchased 3 bottles of carbolic acid, 2 pounds of salt, several yards of muslin cloth, and an unusual amount of lavender oil. When I asked him if he was well, he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold and said he was preparing something special. His eyes looked hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. Thomas had stopped attending church, which was notable in a community where religious observance was expected. When the pastor, Reverend William Morrison, visited Thomas's cabin in early March, he was turned away at the door. In his weekly sermon notes, now preserved in the Vermont Historical Society archives, Reverend Morrison wrote, "Thomas Whitmore is lost to grief. He would not allow me entry to his home, claiming he was engaged in important work and could not be disturbed. Through the window, I glimpsed what appeared to be white sheets covering something in his main room. The smell that came from inside was strange, medicinal yet sweet, like flowers left too long in standing water. Other neighbors began reporting odd occurrences. James Porter, whose property bordered Thomas's, told the sheriff in his later testimony that he could hear Thomas talking inside the cabin late at night, having what sounded like conversations with someone else, though Porter never saw anyone enter or leave the property except Thomas himself. "I'd hear him laughing sometimes, around midnight," Porter stated in the official report. "Not crazy laughter, but normal, like someone enjoying pleasant company. Then I'd hear him say things like, 'You look beautiful tonight,' or 'Let me fix your hair.' At first, I thought maybe he'd found comfort with another woman, which would have been scandalous so soon after Eliza's passing, but seemed understandable given his grief. But then I realized I only ever heard one voice, just Thomas, talking and talking into the silence. The proprietor of Grayson's General Store, Edmund Grayson, kept meticulous records of all transactions. These records, preserved in ledger books that are now part of the Vermont State Archives, show that throughout February and March of 1898, Thomas Whitmore made regular purchases that, in retrospect, paint a disturbing picture. Every week, he bought fresh flowers, an extravagance in winter Vermont, where flowers had to be imported at great expense from greenhouses in Burlington. He purchased women's perfume, hairpins, ribbon, and on one occasion, a lady's dress from the catalog selection. He bought candles in bulk, expensive beeswax candles that burned clean and bright. He also purchased chemicals, formaldehyde solution, alum powder, zinc chloride, and arsenic, which he claimed was for preserving wood in the house he'd built. "I didn't question it at the time," Grayson later testified. "Thomas was a carpenter. It seemed reasonable he'd need wood preservatives. And the other items, the dress and the perfume, I assumed he was perhaps sending them to family members back east. It wasn't my place to pry into a grieving man's purchases." But the most unsettling report came from young Sarah Pemberton, a 14-year-old girl who lived with her family about half a mile from Thomas's cabin. On March 15th, 1898, Sarah was walking home from a friend's house just after sunset. She had to pass by Thomas's property, and as she did, she looked through the cabin's main window. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. In her testimony, given years later when she was a grown woman, Sarah described the scene. "I saw them at the table, Mr. Whitmore and a woman. At first I thought it was Eliza, risen from the dead like Lazarus, and I nearly screamed. But then I looked closer, and I realized the woman wasn't moving. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, wearing a white dress with lace at the collar. Mr. Whitmore was sitting across from her, and he was talking to her, animated and happy, gesturing as if she were responding. He reached across the table and adjusted something on her, like he was fixing her posture. And that's when I saw her, face in the candlelight. Her skin was wrong, too pale, too waxy, and her eyes were open but empty, like a doll's eyes. I ran home and told my father, but he thought I was making up stories." Sarah's father, Robert Pemberton, did not take his daughter's claims seriously. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, the idea that Thomas Whitmore was doing something unthinkable seemed impossible. Grief made people act strangely. Isolation drove men to talk to themselves. These were accepted facts of mountain life. But Sarah's testimony was corroborated by another witness, though this second account wouldn't emerge until much later. Henry Walsh, the town's part-time deputy, had been assigned to check on Thomas in late March, concerned about the man's isolation and worried he might harm himself in his grief. In his official report, dated March 28, 1898, Walsh wrote, "Visited the Whitmore cabin at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Subject did not enter door immediately. After several minutes of knocking, Mr. Whitmore appeared. He seemed agitated, nervous, and positioned himself so I could not see into the cabin interior. I asked if he was well. He assured me he was fine and that he was working on a special project that required his full attention. I asked about funeral arrangements for Miss Frost. He became visibly disturbed and said the matter was handled privately and he did not wish to discuss it further. I noted a strong smell of chemical preservatives and floral scent coming from inside. Mr. Whitmore closed the door before I could inquire further. Throughout March, as the snow began its slow melt and the first hints of spring appeared in the valleys, Thomas Whitmore withdrew further from society. He stopped making regular trips to town. His purchases were made quickly, silently, with no small talk or social pleasantries. People who encountered him described his appearance as deteriorating. Unwashed hair, clothes that hung loose on his frame as if he'd lost significant weight, and most disturbing, a smell that clung to him, that medicinal sweet odor that seemed to emanate from his very pores. By early April, when the roads had cleared enough for regular travel and the ground had thawed sufficiently for burial, several community members approached Harold Frost to ask about final arrangements for his daughter. Where was Eliza's body? When would the funeral take place? Why had there been no burial announcement? Harold Frost, it turned out, had been under the impression that Thomas had arranged everything with the church and that Eliza's body was being kept in the town's cold storage facility, waiting for a proper ceremony once weather permitted. When confronted with the reality that no such arrangements had been made, that the storage facility had no record of receiving Eliza Frost's remains, and that Thomas Whitmore had essentially vanished into isolation with no explanation, Harold Frost went directly to Sheriff Coleman Matthews. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. What do you believe Thomas has done? Share your theories with our community, because what comes next is more disturbing than most people are willing to imagine. On April 7, 1898, Sheriff Coleman Matthews, accompanied by Deputy Henry Walsh, Dr. Samuel Hendricks, and Harold Frost, made their way to Thomas Whitmore's cabin. It was a clear spring morning, the kind that promised renewal and life, completely at odds with what they were about to discover. The official report, written by Sheriff Matthews and preserved in the Caledonia County records, describes their approach. We arrived at the Whitmore property at approximately 9:30 in the morning. The cabin appeared well maintained from the exterior, with freshly cut firewood stacked neatly and the windows clean. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was inside. I knocked on the door and announced our presence. There was no immediate response. After several minutes of knocking and calling Thomas's name, Sheriff Matthews made the decision to force entry. The door, surprisingly, was unlocked. What happened when that door opened would be described in multiple testimonies, each person present trying to capture in words something that defied rational description. Dr. Hendricks's medical report provides the most clinical account. Upon entering the dwelling, we were immediately struck by a powerful olfactory assault. The air contained a mixture of chemical preservatives, predominantly carbolic acid and formaldehyde, combined with floral scents, specifically lavender and rose, and underlying it all, the unmistakable sweet rot smell of decomposing organic matter. The main room of the cabin had been converted into what can only be described as a grotesque parlor. Harold Frost's testimony, given through tears days later, was more raw. I saw my daughter, my Eliza, sitting at a table, like she was having tea, but she wasn't my daughter anymore. She was something else, something horrible dressed up to look like her. Sheriff Matthews's report continues. The deceased, Miss Eliza Frost, was positioned in a chair at the dining table. She was dressed in a white wedding gown, handmade with intricate lace work. Her hair had been styled and adorned with fresh flowers. Her hands were positioned on the table in front of her, one holding a teacup, the other resting palm down on the wood. The subject's eyes were open, having been held in place by what Dr. Hendricks later identified as wire supports beneath the eyelids. The preservation work Thomas had done was, in its own horrifying way, remarkable. Using techniques that seemed to combine traditional embalming practices with experimental methods of his own design, he had managed to keep Eliza's body in a state that, from a distance, might have appeared almost lifelike. But up close, the truth was undeniable. Eliza Frost was dead, had been dead for nearly 2 months, and what Thomas had created was not preservation, but a macabre puppet, a shell that mimicked life while being thoroughly, absolutely dead. The cabin's interior revealed the full extent of Thomas's obsession. Multiple chairs were positioned throughout the space, arranged as if for conversation. In one corner, a piano that Thomas must have dragged from somewhere sat with sheet music open on the stand. Eliza's body had clearly been moved around the cabin, positioned in different locations for different activities, sitting at the piano, standing by the window, lying in the bed upstairs. On the dining table, in addition to the tea service, there were place settings for 2. Thomas had apparently been taking meals with Eliza's corpse, sitting across from her, maintaining the fiction of her continued existence. Deputy Walsh found a calendar on the wall where Thomas had marked each day with notations. Breakfast with E. Read poetry to E. Fixed E's hair. Danced with E until midnight. The entries read like a journal of a normal courtship, except for the inescapable reality that Eliza had been dead the entire time. Where was Thomas during all of this? Sheriff Matthews describes finding him upstairs in the sleeping loft. The subject was discovered sitting on the floor beside the bed, apparently in a state of exhaustion or collapse. He was conscious but unresponsive to our initial attempts to communicate. His appearance was shocking. Extreme weight loss, unhealthy pallor, signs of severe sleep deprivation. When he finally spoke, his words were, "Is it time for her to get ready? She likes to watch the sunrise." Thomas Whitmore was immediately taken into custody. As they removed him from the cabin, he became agitated, asking repeatedly who would care for Eliza, who would make sure she wasn't lonely, who would fix her hair the way she liked it. According to all witnesses, he seemed genuinely confused about why he was being arrested, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would object to what he'd done. Harold Frost, after one look at what his daughter had been subjected to, collapsed and had to be carried from the cabin. Dr. Hendricks stayed behind to examine the remains and document the scene for official purposes. What Dr. Hendricks found in Thomas Whitmore's cabin went far beyond the horror of a preserved corpse. In the days following the discovery, as he meticulously catalogued evidence for the subsequent legal proceedings, a picture emerged of a man who had descended into complete delusion, creating an elaborate fantasy world where death had never occurred. In a trunk at the foot of the bed, Hendricks discovered Thomas's journals, multiple volumes filled with dense handwriting. These journals, which are now sealed in the Vermont State Archives and available only to researchers with special permission, document Thomas's psychological deterioration with chilling clarity. The entries begin normally enough, dated from Thomas's arrival in Vermont in 1895. They describe his daily work, his first meeting with Eliza, the development of their relationship. The writing is coherent, thoughtful, showing a man who was articulate and self-aware. But after Eliza's death, the journals transform. The entry from February 14th, 1898, the day she died, reads, "She left me today, but I will not accept this. I have made her a promise, and I will keep Keep it. She will not disappear. She will not be put in the cold ground to be forgotten. I know what I must do. I've been reading, studying, preparing for this possibility. The Egyptians understood that the body is sacred, that preservation is an act of love. If I work carefully, if I apply everything I've learned, I can keep her with me. She doesn't have to leave. Subsequent entries describe his preservation process in disturbing detail. Thomas had apparently been studying embalming techniques, reading medical texts he'd ordered from Boston, corresponding with undertakers under the pretense of wanting to learn the trade. He'd been preparing for Eliza's death, perhaps since her diagnosis, perhaps even before. The preservation work involved injecting Eliza's body with various chemical solutions through the major arteries, a crude form of arterial embalming. He'd packed her body cavities with salt and preservative compounds. He'd applied cosmetics to maintain the appearance of healthy skin tone. Most disturbingly, he'd developed a system using wire and wooden supports to pose the body in various positions, essentially creating a full-sized articulated mannequin from his dead fiancée. One journal entry from March reads, "Eliza and I had breakfast by the window this morning. The sunlight made her hair glow like copper. I told her about the furniture I'm planning to build once spring arrives fully. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was pleased. Her smile is fainter now, harder to maintain, but I found that applying rose oil to her lips helps. She's so beautiful, even in her silence, especially in her silence. Sometimes I think she's more herself now than she ever was when she was distracted by all the noise of living." Dr. Hendricks also found evidence of Thomas's practical preparations. Hidden in the cellar were additional bottles of preservative chemicals, enough to last for months or possibly years. There were books on taxidermy, anatomical drawings, and sketches Thomas had made of Eliza from every angle, as if he was studying her form for artistic reproduction. Most chilling was a letter Thomas had begun writing to Harold Frost, but never sent, found tucked inside one of the journals. "Dear Mr. Frost, I want you to understand that I have not taken Eliza from you out of disrespect or cruelty. I have saved her. She would have been put in the ground, would have rotted away until nothing remained but bones and memories. I could not allow that. You raised a daughter too beautiful, too perfect to surrender to decay. What I've done is an act of preservation, of devotion, of love in its purest form. When you understand this, I hope you will visit. She asks about you sometimes in her way. I know she misses you." The cabin also contained a wedding ceremony program that Thomas had written himself, dated for June 15th, 1898, the day he and Eliza had originally planned to marry. There were 2 wedding rings on the table, and in his journal, Thomas had written about his plans to conduct the ceremony himself, with Eliza in her wedding gown, making their union official even in death. Among the evidence, Deputy Walsh found something that particularly disturbed the investigators: photographs. Thomas had set up a camera on a tripod and taken photographs of himself with Eliza's body. In these images, he posed beside her, sometimes with his arm around her stiff shoulders, sometimes holding her hands, always smiling, as if they were a normal couple documenting their lives together. The photographs, perhaps more than anything else, illustrated the depth of Thomas's delusion. In his mind, Eliza was still alive, still present, still his partner, in a continued existence that only he could perceive. Dr. Hendricks's final medical report concluded, "The subject, Thomas Whitmore, appears to have suffered a complete psychological break from reality, coinciding with the death of Miss Eliza Frost. His actions, while methodical and showing considerable planning, stem from a mind unable to process loss and mortality. What he has done to the deceased's remains represents not only a criminal act, but a profound testament to how grief, when unchecked, can transform into something monstrous." The discovery at Thomas Whitmore's cabin sent shockwaves through the Vermont community and, eventually, across New England. News of the case reached newspapers in Burlington, Boston, and even New York City. Headlines screamed variations of "Carpenter keeps dead bride," "Vermont man's macabre preservation," and "Love beyond death turns to horror." The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the fact that there were few precedents for prosecuting someone for what Thomas had done. He was charged with multiple offenses: unlawful possession of human remains, desecration of a corpse, and violations of public health ordinances. The question of his sanity immediately became central to the case. The trial took place in June of 1898 in the Caledonia County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed every day, with spectators traveling from across the region to witness the proceedings. Thomas sat silently through most of the trial, occasionally asking his attorney when he would be allowed to return home to care for Eliza. 3 psychiatrists examined Thomas. Their reports, which varied considerably, all agreed on one point. Thomas Whitmore genuinely believed Eliza was still alive in some meaningful sense. He could not or would not acknowledge her death as final. When shown photographs of her corpse taken during the investigation, Thomas would say things like, "She looks tired in that one," or "That's not her best dress." Dr. Hendricks testified about the physical condition of Eliza's remains, providing details so disturbing that several members of the jury and multiple spectators had to leave the courtroom. He described how Thomas's preservation methods had been somewhat effective in the short term, but were ultimately futile. Decomposition had continued despite the chemicals, and what Thomas had been living with in those final weeks was increasingly a rotting corpse disguised by makeup, perfume, and clothing. Harold Frost testified briefly, his appearance shocking those who knew him. He had aged dramatically, his grief compounded by the horror of what had been done to his daughter. He stated simply, "That man stole my daughter's dignity. He turned her death into something obscene. Whatever punishment this court decides, it cannot undo what he has done to my memories of Eliza. Every time I think of her now, I see what he made her into." The defense attempted to argue that Thomas was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions. They brought forward witnesses who testified to his changed behavior after Eliza's death, his obvious mental deterioration, his complete disconnect from reality. The prosecution countered that Thomas's actions showed planning and awareness, that his preservation techniques required conscious study and deliberate effort, indicating he knew what he was doing, even if his motivations were delusional. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The foreman later said that the difficulty wasn't in determining whether Thomas had committed the acts. Clearly he had, but in deciding whether he understood the wrongness of what he'd done. Eventually, they reached a verdict: guilty on all counts, but with a recommendation for psychiatric evaluation and treatment. Thomas Whitmore was sentenced to 20 years in the Vermont State Asylum for the Insane, located in Waterbury. He would never return to society. Records from the asylum, sparse as they are, indicate that Thomas never regained what could be considered normal mental function. He continued to speak of Eliza in the present tense, to plan for their future together, to maintain the fiction of her continued existence. In his final years, asylum attendants reported that Thomas had developed an obsession with his hands, constantly examining them, cleaning them, saying they needed to be ready for when he could return to his work. He died in 1923 at the age of 53 from pneumonia. His last words, according to the attending nurse, were, "Tell Eliza I'll be home soon. Tell her not to wait dinner for me." Eliza Frost was finally laid to rest in a sealed casket in the family plot in the town cemetery. Harold Frost had her remains examined by multiple doctors, all of whom confirmed the horror of what had been done to her. He paid for an elaborate memorial stone with the inscription, Eliza Marie Frost, 1876-1898, beloved daughter, may she finally rest in peace. The cabin where Thomas had kept Eliza was burned to the ground in August of 1898. Harold Frost personally set the fire, standing watch as the structure collapsed into ash. Neighbors reported that he spoke not a single word. During the burning, simply watching until there was nothing left but blackened timber and memories too dark to preserve. The case became a source of shame for the community. People who had been neighbors to Thomas, who had purchased his furniture, who had attended the same church, now wondered what signs they had missed. How had no one intervened sooner? Why had Sarah Pemberton's testimony been dismissed? Could Eliza have been spared this final indignity if someone had acted on their suspicions? Pastor William Morrison delivered a sermon the Sunday after Thomas's sentencing. His notes, preserved in the church archives, show his struggle to make sense of what had happened. We must ask ourselves what love truly means. Thomas Whitmore claimed to love Eliza Frost, but what he did was the opposite of love. Love respects boundaries. Love accepts mortality. Love understands that to truly honor someone is to let them go when their time comes. What Thomas did was not love. It was possession, obsession, the corruption of every good feeling into something diseased and wrong. But even as the community tried to move forward, to forget, to heal, the story of Thomas and Eliza refused to die. It passed into local legend, whispered about in quiet conversations, used by parents to frighten children into good behavior. Don't wander too far from home, or you might end up like poor Eliza Frost. The incident had lasting effects on Vermont burial practices. The state legislature, prompted by the case, passed new laws requiring death certificates to be filed within 48 hours and remains to be accounted for by licensed undertakers. Cold storage facilities for winter burials were required to maintain detailed logs. The regulations, known informally as the Eliza Frost laws, remained in effect until the 1960s. The story of Eliza Frost and Thomas Whitmore did not end with his sentencing and her burial. Over the decades that followed, new information emerged, fragments of evidence that added layers to an already disturbing tale, suggesting that what happened in that cabin was perhaps even more complex than the original investigation revealed. In 1927, 4 years after Thomas's death, a Vermont Historical Society researcher named Margaret Aldrich was cataloging documents from the Waterbury Asylum when she discovered something that had been overlooked during the original trial, a second set of journals belonging to Thomas Whitmore. These journals, apparently confiscated when Thomas was first institutionalized but never submitted as evidence, covered the period from 1896 to early 1898, before Eliza's death. What Margaret found in these pages was deeply unsettling. The journals revealed that Thomas had been preparing for Eliza's death long before she became sick. Entries from November 1896, more than a year before Eliza contracted tuberculosis, included passages like, "I dream constantly of losing her. In my dreams she slips away and I am powerless to stop it. I have begun researching methods of preservation. If the unthinkable should happen, I must be ready. I cannot lose her to the earth. I cannot let her disappear." Margaret Aldrich published a paper about her findings in the Journal of Vermont History in 1929, titled "Premeditated Preservation: New Evidence in the Whitmore Case." In it, she argued that Thomas's actions after Eliza's death were not a spontaneous response to grief, but the culmination of a long-standing obsession with preventing her loss. She wrote, "Thomas Whitmore was preparing to preserve Eliza Frost even while she was healthy and alive. This suggests his relationship with her was fundamentally diseased from the start, built not on love, as we understand it, but on a pathological fear of abandonment that expressed itself through fantasies of possession beyond death. The paper caused controversy. Some scholars argued that Margaret was reading too much into what could have been normal anxiety about losing a loved one. Others saw her interpretation as vindication of the prosecution's original argument that Thomas had known exactly what he was doing. But more revelations were coming. In 1953, during renovation of the old Grayson General Store building, construction workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Thomas. Whitmore and postmarked from various locations across New England between 1895 and 1898. The letters were from suppliers of mortuary goods, taxidermists, and medical supply companies. They were responses to inquiries Thomas had made, asking about preservation techniques, chemical formulas, and methods for maintaining human remains. The earliest letter was dated March 1895, 3 years before Eliza's death, before Thomas had even met her. This discovery raised a horrifying possibility. Had Thomas come to Vermont specifically seeking someone to become the subject of his preservation fantasies? Had his courtship of Eliza been, from the very beginning, part of a plan to eventually possess her in death? Local historian David Frost, no relation to Harold Frost, despite the shared surname, investigated this theory in his 1968 book, Dark Mountains: True Crimes of Rural Vermont. He tracked Thomas's movements before his arrival in Vermont and uncovered disturbing patterns. In New Hampshire, where Thomas claimed to have lived previously, David found records of another young woman, Catherine Mills, who had been briefly engaged to a carpenter named Thomas Whitmore in 1894. Catherine had died suddenly of pneumonia in January 1895. Her family had reported strange behavior from Thomas after her death, including his insistence on being alone with her body before burial. Catherine's father had forcibly removed Thomas from their home and banned him from the funeral. Thomas had left New Hampshire shortly after. Was this the same Thomas Whitmore? David Frost believed so, though he couldn't prove it conclusively. The descriptions matched: quiet, skilled craftsman, intense demeanor, obsessive attention to detail. If it was the same man, then Eliza Frost was not his first victim, merely his most successful preservation attempt. In 1976, the Vermont State Hospital, formerly the asylum where Thomas had been confined, began a project to digitize old patient records. A psychiatric social worker named Linda Morrison, reviewing Thomas Whitmore's file, discovered session notes from a doctor who had treated Thomas in 1921. The notes included a transcript of a conversation where Thomas, in a rare moment of apparent lucidity, had said something chilling. "You think I'm crazy because I kept her. But what's crazier, accepting that someone you love just vanishes forever, or finding a way to make them stay? Everyone wants their loved ones to stay. I just had the courage to do something about it. If I could go back, I'd do it again. I'd do it better. I'd find a way to make her last forever." These words suggested that even after years of institutionalization, Thomas maintained his belief that what he'd done was not only justified, but admirable. He saw himself not as a criminal or a madman, but as someone who had solved the fundamental problem of human existence: how to prevent loss. Perhaps the most disturbing later discovery came in 1982, when Harold Frost's great-granddaughter, Jennifer Frost, was going through family documents in preparation for writing a family history. In a box of letters and papers that had belonged to Harold, Jennifer found something that had apparently never been shared with authorities: letters from Eliza to her father, written during her final illness. In one letter, dated February 10th, 1898, just 4 days before her death, Eliza wrote, "Father, I must tell you something about Thomas that troubles me. Yesterday, when I was drifting in and out of fever, I woke to find him sketching me. He did not know I was awake. He was drawing my face from multiple angles, and he was crying but smiling too. He whispered things I could not quite hear, but I caught phrases. 'I'll keep you safe. You'll never leave me. I know what to do.' Father, I'm frightened. There is something in his eyes that is not right. He loves me, I know he does, but it is a love that feels like drowning. If I do not survive this illness, please do not let him near my body. I fear what he might do. I fear he cannot let me go." This letter was never sent. Eliza was too weak to mail it herself, and it remained in her personal effects. Harold, discovering it after the horror at the cabin, had apparently kept it private out of guilt. If he had taken Eliza's fears seriously, if he had banned Thomas from her deathbed, would any of this have happened? Jennifer Frost shared the letter with historians, and it fundamentally changed the understanding of the case. Eliza had known, on some level, what Thomas was capable of. She had tried to warn her father. Her final days had been spent not only fighting disease, but living with the knowledge that the man who claimed to love her most was planning something terrible. The discovery added a layer of tragedy to an already tragic story. Eliza Frost had been a victim not only of tuberculosis and Thomas's obsession, but of a system that didn't take a dying woman's fears seriously, that prioritized social propriety over protecting the vulnerable. More than a century has passed since Thomas Whitmore transformed his grief into horror, and Eliza Frost's body became a prisoner of his delusion. The cabin is long gone, burned to ash and scattered by wind. The people who witnessed the discovery have all died, carrying their memories of that spring morning to their own graves. Even the Vermont State Asylum, where Thomas spent his final years, has been closed. Its buildings empty monuments to a different era's understanding of madness. But the story refuses to die. It persists in local legend, in historical records, in the uncomfortable questions it raises about love, loss, and the line between devotion and obsession. What truly happened in Thomas Whitmore's mind? Was he simply a man destroyed by grief? Someone whose love for Eliza was so profound that her death shattered his sanity completely? Or was he something darker, a predator who had been searching for someone to become the subject of his preservation fantasies, someone who deliberately sought out a relationship knowing it would end in possession? The evidence supports multiple interpretations, and perhaps that's what makes this case so deeply disturbing. There are at least 3 viable theories about Thomas Whitmore. Theory 1, grief-induced insanity. This interpretation suggests Thomas was a normal man who loved Eliza genuinely. When she died, especially so suddenly and so close to their planned wedding, his mind could not process the loss. His preservation of her body was a desperate attempt to deny death's finality, a psychological break rather than a premeditated plan. The letters and journals showing earlier preparation could be interpreted as normal anxiety about loss rather than evidence of dark planning. Theory 2. Premeditated obsession. This theory holds that Thomas was fundamentally disturbed long before Eliza's death. His study of preservation techniques, his possible connection to Catherine Mills's death in New Hampshire, his detailed preparation for death, even while Eliza was healthy, all suggest a man who was building toward this moment. In this interpretation, Thomas didn't love Eliza as a person, but as an object he planned to eventually possess completely. Her death, while it may have caused genuine grief, also gave him permission to execute plans he'd been developing for years. Theory 3. The occult connection. Some researchers have suggested a third possibility based on evidence of occult practices in 19th century Vermont. Several books on necromancy and spiritual preservation were found in Thomas's cabin. Some local legends suggested Thomas had been seen visiting an old woman in the mountains who practiced folk magic. This theory proposes that Thomas believed he could keep Eliza's spirit bound to her preserved body, that his actions were not just about physical preservation, but about preventing her soul from departing. This interpretation is the least supported by evidence, but remains popular in certain circles. Which theory is correct? Perhaps all of them contain elements of truth. Perhaps Thomas was a grieving man whose obsession was amplified by pre-existing psychological problems and possibly influenced by exposure to occult ideas. Human motivation is rarely simple, and the darkest acts often emerge from combinations of factors rather than single causes. What we know with certainty is this: Eliza Frost died of tuberculosis in February of 1898. Thomas Whitmore kept her body in his cabin for nearly 2 months, preserving it through chemical treatment and maintaining the fiction of her continued life. He took meals with her corpse, dressed it, posed it, photographed it, and spoke to it as if she were still present. When discovered, he showed no recognition that what he'd done was wrong. The case changed Vermont burial laws. It became a cautionary tale about grief left unchecked. It raised questions about mental illness that the medicine of the time could not adequately answer, and it stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how love, that emotion we celebrate as the highest human capacity, can transform into something monstrous when it refuses to acknowledge limits, boundaries, and the fundamental fact of mortality. Today, the cemetery, where Eliza Frost is buried, remains accessible to the public. Her grave is well maintained, though the elaborate headstone Harold Frost commissioned has weathered over the decades. Occasionally, someone who has heard her story will visit, leaving flowers, standing in silence, acknowledging a young woman whose death became something far worse than simply dying. Locals sometimes report strange occurrences near the site where Thomas's cabin once stood. Odd smells carried on the wind, lavender and chemicals mixed with decay. The sound of someone talking late at night when the area should be empty. These are probably just stories, the kind of legends that accumulate around places touched by horror. But they persist, passed down through generations, keeping the memory of Eliza Frost and Thomas Whitmore alive long after both have turned to dust. To this day, no one can say with certainty what drove Thomas Whitmore to do what he did. We can analyze, theorize, and debate, but the truth died. With him in that asylum in 1923, his final thoughts fixed on a woman he couldn't save and wouldn't release. Some loves, it seems, really are worse than death. Before we close, I want to thank you for journeying with me through this dark chapter of Vermont history. If this story affected you, if it made you think about loss and love and the terrible things we do to avoid goodbye, please share your thoughts in the comments below. What theory do you believe? Do you think Thomas was mad, or was he something worse? If you found this investigation compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel. Hit that notification bell to join our haunted community and be alerted when we uncover the next forgotten horror from history's shadows. We have more stories waiting, more mysteries buried in archives, more truths that people try to forget. Share this video with someone brave enough to listen. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's remember Eliza Frost, not just as a victim, but as a real person whose life and death deserve to be acknowledged with dignity, even now, more than a century later. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, the past is never truly dead. Sometimes it's not even past. Thank you for listening. This is your host signing off from the darkest corners of history.